Hello, it is Tyler Selhorn, the newly hired head of remote at Polygon, introducing you to the event session called Do You Need a Head of Remote? Brought to you by the head of remote at Doist, Chase Warrington, featuring the head of remote at GitLab, Darren Murph, featuring the remote lead at Cargo.one, Steph Lee, and head of dynamic work at Okta, Samantha Fisher. Shout out to the Doist team for sponsoring the coffee at on site there in Montreal. Async communication is the main power of remote work, and you need to have the right tools in place to make the most out of it. Twist by Doist is the best asynchronous messaging for teams burned out by real-time chat, video calls, and email. Are you tired of constantly being distracted by colleagues' messages? Twist is the perfect tool for deep work in a team setting. You cannot see if people are online. You are encouraged not to notify everyone all the time. There is no glowing green dot encouraging you to be always on. It's got the balance just right. 450,000 people have already made the radical switch to Twist to work async, not ASAP. Check them out at twist.com, running remote.
All right. Welcome back, everyone, from lunch. I have some amazing news. I didn't spill on my shirt, okay? That was like the whole objective around lunch was not to, who did spill on their shirt? Just for sake of transparency. Ali did for sure, you know. It's all right. It's okay. Welcome back. This is one of the panels that we've really been looking forward to more than anything. Do you need a head of remote? Yes. You most certainly do. But first I want to talk about something else we do here at Running Remote, the Running Remote community. And if you want the information and the connections and the vibe year round for what this conference brings, I suggest you join the Running Remote community. Kasia is our community manager. Say hello to everybody. And I'm actually going to bring on stage a couple of our heads of remote who are also community members. Chase and Darren, don't be scared. Okay, come on out. Ladies and gentlemen, Chase and Darren, the heads of remote at Doist and GitLab, respectively. And within that community, what do we find, right? We find founders, we find operations executives, we find thought leaders. I think you two are all three of those things, basically. Well, you're not founders, but 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
That ain't
bad. Both of you have hosted Ask Me Anythings. What has it been like? I'll start with you, Darren. What has it been like being part of the Running Remote community?
It's just great to have community. It's great to have like-minded people that want to challenge you to make sure that you're evaluating your blind spots, but also encourage you and be an advocate for you. And look, we're building something new together, and community is everything.
Yeah, we really appreciate you being part of it. So I'm going to ask you the same question and hand you the mic.
Oh, you're going to make me follow Darren. That's just brutal, man. No, the Running Remote community has been amazing for me. I've been able to meet people like Darren and others that are here today that I'm meeting for the first time. But I just find it incredibly invaluable for me. I get to go out there, ask questions, get outside the bubble of where I'm working every day, and really learn from the pros. So I highly recommend it to anybody that really wants to up-level their remote work game. Running Remote community.
How do you like that? info@runningremote.com, or just go to Kasia and say, hey, I want to be in the community. I encourage all of you to join. Okay, Samantha and Stephanie, let's talk about heads of remote. Chase?
Thank you. Sir.
Thank you. I'm right there.
Am I there?
You're in the wrong seat.
Hey, guys.
Chase,
I feel
what's
really
up?
far right now.
This
Like,
is
I know.
happening.
Social distancing.
Finally.
It's surreal to be speaking to everyone here in person.
Yeah.
good.
Just pretend like all these people aren't here. We've been, we all get to interact a little bit one-on-one from time to time, but it's really awesome for me to be hosting this panel with all of you. I've learned a lot from you over the years, and I talked to a lot of people last night, people who are out here right now, who were super excited about this panel in particular. So I think we've assembled some of the real pioneers of this remote lead position, which, as we all know, is very new. And I think we're going to learn a lot today. So I don't want to waste any more time. I'm going to get right into the line of questioning. I would love for you guys to take a few minutes, describe what you do, the distribution of your company, how you guys are set up, how long you've been doing remote, and I think most importantly, the thing we really want to dive into is how do you define your job title in the context of what you're doing in your organizations? We'll start with that, and then we'll hop into some of the other questions. We'll also have, just so you guys know, about 10, 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience, which I'm really looking forward to. Darren?
Yeah, so I joined GitLab in July of 2019 and started to pioneer what this role was. So for context, when I joined GitLab, it was an all-remote company, all remote from inception. We were around 700 people. We've scaled to over 1,600 now. And I knew from the jump that this was going to be a massive opportunity to build something new. I didn't know that COVID would be an accelerant for a lot of other organizations to pay attention to it. But it really sits at the intersection of operations and strategic communications, both of which are really critical when you're stewarding massive amounts of behavioral change.
Stephanie?
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm the remote lead at Cargo.one. We are 116 people last time I checked, across 17 countries, 80% of which are in EMEA and 20% in North America and APAC. We're digitalizing the air cargo space, so it's a really old industry, and we're bringing it to the modern age, as I like to think about that. And by virtue of the industry and the distribution of the industry, it makes sense for us to go remote. We've been remote since pre-pandemic. They moved from office first to remote first, and my job in the organization is to figure out how to take us to the next level, to thrive as a remote company. So I work on our operating system as a company. I work on our culture, how we connect people. That's a big one in the remote work sphere. And anything that touches our remote OS passes by my desk.
I think that's a really interesting aspect of it we'll get into more, because how do you define the difference between when you are a fully remote team operating and being remote is kind of one and the same, but it's also its own ball game that you have to figure out how to play. So I think we'll get into that as we go further. Sam?
Yeah, so I'm Sam Fisher. Sorry, excuse me. I'm head of dynamic work at Okta. We are about 5,500 people now, with growing pretty substantially year over year. When I joined the company in December of 2019, or December of 2020, excuse me, they were already moving to a hybrid environment. And so dynamic work is what we call our hybrid environment. We really focus on choice and flexibility and building community and equity of experience across those different pillars for our dynamic employees. And my job is really to kind of set the strategy. So it's very similar to Darren's and probably to some degree Stephanie's, but my role is really around looking at an employee life cycle within the organization, and then actually looking at an employee's life events in their own environment, in their personal environment, and how do we mesh those two things together so that employees feel a sense of empowerment to make those choices, to be flexible in their work arrangements, to grow our talent acquisition and retention. So it really touches all of our people and places functions, as well as all of our business leaders, and how they think about how they operate their teams and how that operation really drives and propels our business.
So that was a perfect segue, because the first question I really want to get into, when people ask me about, what does a head of remote do? Where does it sit on the org chart? I'm sure you've all gotten this question to some degree. And something I usually respond with, and I've probably stolen from one of you, is that it's a highly cross-functional role. It sits in a lot of different places. It touches a lot of different departments, and this is all very true. So I'd love to hear you guys talk to this, and I'll direct this one to you, Stephanie, and when we can let others chime in. Let's speak to that cross-functionality of the position. How does that look in your day-to-day, and what does that look like in the organization as a whole?
Yeah, so, that's a great question. I think the head of remote setup is different for every organization, and it's really tailored to what the organization needs. So where I sit in Cargo.one is in the people team. So I work with our people partner. I work with our people ops manager to, look at our employee experience from from hiring all the way to onboarding and offboarding. But in my role, I also work with the chiefs of staff, and I work with the CEOs, and I work with marketing when it comes to employer branding. So if it's about how we meet and our touch points, I will have conversations with chiefs of staff and the CEOs. If it's about onboarding and hiring, then it's my team. If it's about marketing, then it's, if it's about employer branding, then it's marketing. And if it's about offsites, it's everyone, because meeting in person is really important to us.
I find that really interesting too. Your role is similar to mine in that way, in that we're both very involved in the only non-remote aspect of the remote workforce, which is our offsites. But this is something that I think is really interesting. As far as I know, Darren, I don't believe you're really involved in the offsites aspect. Sam, I'm not sure if you are.
So offsites are part of our team. So I operate within the people and places team. So we joined our people organization with our workplace organization, I guess about maybe 6 months ago, because it really was about the life cycle and the journey of an employee. So from the time we first engaged with them as a recruiting option, all the way through the onboarding, the life cycle of while you're an employee, the different stages of an employee journey, and then if an employee decides to leave, what that exit looks like. So we do, our travel and our events team is part of our people and places team. And so we really think about it as a curated experience across all those different dimensions.
Interesting. So do you, let's clarify real quick, you're over 5,000 people.
Right.
And you guys are hybrid, so you have people working across all time zone. What's the fair distribution there?
Yeah, so we have 13 locations is our footprint. We have 5 locations domestically, and then the rest are all international, and they range everywhere from EMEA to APAC, down into Sydney. We just opened a new Sydney or a Dublin hub in Ireland. And so, we work across all different time zones, and teams are distributed, and teams are becoming more and more distributed. So even particularly G&A functions, which we had seen historically were kind of congregated in little nucleuses or centers of gravity, are really expanding. Like our accounting team now has, I think, the leadership team has, I think, 8 people, and none of them live in the same time zone.
Wow, that is super impressive. I think it's just amazing for all of us that have been involved in remote work for some time now to hear about companies like yours that are in the thousands now and fully distributed or hybrid, even distributed across so many time zones, and to hear about how there's actually somebody in the role of trying to figure out how to make that work is really exciting. Can you speak a little bit more to the cross-functionality aspect of where you're working within the team and how that looks like in your day-to-day?
Yeah, so I would say very similar to Stephanie, if there is something that touches an employee, it comes through our organization on the people side. So I spend a lot of my time with our HRBPs, so our business people partners, mostly because for a lot of our employees, and this is one of the things we've been talking about most recently, is what they've been doing for the last 2 years is not what we would consider to be dynamic work. They were working from home in a pandemic, and they're doing it remotely. We really want to talk to people about what is dynamic work, why is it different, what is it different from being a remote first company versus being an office first company. And so what I'd spend a lot of time with right now is our learning and development teams building learning courses and different self-directed courses so people can understand what that looks like, as well as assets and things like that. We're doing road shows with all of our teams. So we really kind of get into the heart of the organization, and we partner with teams that can help be our advocate. We're a 3-person team on the dynamic work team. We have a few other folks and people in places, but we can't be everything to everyone, particularly an organization that's scaling at our size. So what we're looking for is advocacy that can talk about dynamic work and can talk the elevator pitch and talk about all of the advantages of it with those other cross-functional teams. That's really the primary role of our cross-functionality. It's not so much the execution of it, it's the creating advocacy, creating education, and then awareness of what those features and functionalities are of a dynamic worker.
It's almost like an internal consultant or internal advocate for your greater teams around the organization. It sounds like, I love this. Darren, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I've heard it described as your grand central station for the organization. Because to Sam's point, if you're working in a distributed setting, The one common language or the common thread across your entire organization is now that everyone is working remotely or working in a distributed fashion. And for many teams and for many people, this is brand new to them. So you can't just expect them to be able to understand the nuances, the operational principles of remote first. Even if you toss them a tool that they may have used before, you may be using it differently now when you have people across time zones. And so what this role really does is it serves as Grand Central Station, where other functions and people in the business can come to you, you get them on the right track, and you send them out on whatever their daily journey is. And a lot of it is codifying information, it's absorbing information, learnings from different functions of the business, and then documenting that and cascading it in a way that it becomes education for other parts of the business. So you're a critical partner of every function of the business, because if we're honest, what's happening here is a complete re-architecting of how businesses function. This is no small task. This is a complete rethink of how teams and businesses operate. And so if you're going to do it in a new fashion, having someone in charge of stewarding that change is really essential to accelerating through it.
I'd love to keep it with you for a second, Darren, because I know you've talked to a lot of organizations over the years that are making this transition to having someone in this position. They're curious about, hey, when does it make sense for me to put someone in a remote, head of remote lead, head of dynamic work? When does it make sense for someone to own this? And is that at a certain size? Is it at a certain inflection point? Is it when we reach a certain revenue or user base? Or what is it that causes a company to say, okay, now it makes sense for us to have somebody? I think we'd probably all agree it's not your first hire, but at some point it might make sense to have somebody in this position. So I would love to hear from each of you, but we'll start with you, Darren. How do you answer that question?
I would say as soon as you commit to remote or distributed being any meaningful part of your operational principles, you should have someone in charge of it. No company would spin up a new office and not have an office manager. You wouldn't just kind of let the office fend for itself. And when you think about the virtual office, we can't just let it fend for itself. People need direction. There needs to be tooling and culture and written documentation to steward that. So of course the answer to this question, like most things, is it depends, but as early as practical. When you start building that infrastructure early, it pays great dividends as you scale.
Either of you want to add anything to that?
I agree with you. It depends largely.
No pressure. That's a tough one to follow up on.
Yeah, it's a tough act to follow, but I think it depends on how ready the company is for remote work. If you start as a remote company and everyone is already infused with like that way of working, there's probably a lesser argument to be made that you need one right now. And if you hire someone in the head of remote role, as a company that's grown from the start as a remote company, it's going to look very different from someone like me that's coming into an organization that started in an office and is trying to move in that direction. And of course, the role looks very different. And then the other part of the readiness and for remote work, I think, comes with a sensitivity to how much capacity and how ready is your leadership team to lead the charge for remote work. Because, I mean, C-suite people are busy, right? If they have the capacity to lead it, that's awesome, because at the end of the day, they set the tone for company culture, they set the tone for strategy. But if everyone's at capacity and you need that voice, that person to push it forward so it's not a secondary consideration, then I think you're ready for a head of remote.
I find that really interesting because from my standpoint, I was coming from a pretty well-oiled machine in terms of remote work. Doist has been doing remote for 15 years. We've been remote first since day one. We already had 100 people in 35 countries, and while that's not like huge by some of the standards we're talking about here, we already had a good thing going. So it could be argued, like, do you need somebody to make these small tweaks or not? And I think it's that the point here is that each company runs this role a little bit differently. It doesn't look the same in any one organization. Stephanie, your experience has been very different than mine, and you're actually trying to really change the culture. And I think that's one of the misconceptions maybe, is that you have to have a change agent, or you have to have just somebody who's about advocacy, or there's lots of different dynamic ways that this position can work within different organizations. I think we all kind of represent different styles of the same position being done in various sizes and distributions of organizations.
I think the other piece for that too, excuse me, from a timing perspective, is at an inflection point for an organization, particularly one that is transitioning from an in-office culture to a different culture, even if there's capacity within your leadership, many times they are driven by their own goals and objectives and agendas. And so I also think that it's important for organizations to take a look at where can you find someone who has some objectivity. Because I do think this role requires a very nuanced set of being able to push and pull. And so there's a lot of folks in leadership roles that would say, nope, we're all going to go back to the office. We think that's the best way to do it. And then you probably have people that will be like, well, I don't want to commute the 2 hours, or I've been working remotely and it's all working for me. And so you almost need someone who doesn't have a vested interest in a specific business outcome. And so I think that's the other place of inflection, is if organizations are working towards this. And I would say it's probably more likely in larger organizations, because you just have more people and their focus and their strategies and things are all to some degree divergent, and then coming back together, is having someone in there that can be objective and say, I've heard you, and I've heard you. Now let's talk about what the middle actually looks like, because that's the best place for all of us to be.
Yeah, that's great advice, I think. I think that's very tangible. Sam, staying with you, one thing I think is really interesting is that the title of this talk is, Do You Need a Head of Remote? Your title is Head of Dynamic Work, and that's sounds slightly different, but in a lot of ways, there's obviously lots of red threads here tied between what we're doing. How do you see, for all the, what do we think? We think approximately 75% of companies are going to be hybrid in some way or another if they aren't already. How do you answer the question for that 75% of those companies when they say, do we need somebody in this role? Like, is it necessary? When should we hire one? How do you see the head of remote or the head of dynamic work? How does that play into the hybrid world?
I think it plays into the hybrid world in a very similar way that it does in a remote first world. Again, I would go back to my previous comment, which is, and a little bit to Darren's, which is you're a little bit like, you're the conductor. Right? It's Grand Central Station, we can use a DNA analogy, you're the middle helix, whatever you want to call it, right? You're the glue. Like I always like to say, I'm the glue. And I think regardless of the organization, you need somebody who's thinking about all of these pieces, no matter what you call it. We don't, our philosophy is we are not a remote first company. We've been very forward and specific about that. We really want a place where we also have physical presence in markets, and in some markets that we don't have full offices, we have branded co-working solutions to bring people together and help create that connection in that community. So even in our world where we're not focusing on being a remote first company, we're really focused on the flexibility and the benefits that remote work brings to the equation. You need somebody to be able to talk about that. And you need someone who can not only look at it from, to Darren's point, the operational lens, like what are all the things that have to change, but also the technology in your organization. You need to look at what are your hiring practices, how do you think about your talent distribution, performance management, which I'm sure everybody's wondering like how you do that in a remote world. Let me just be honest, we don't do it well. We're working on it. So again, it's an evolving thing, but if you are a company and you're interested in doing something like this, you have to have somebody who can be the spokesperson for it. Whether it's, your chief people officer or whatever that is, you need to have somebody that can be the spokesperson for it to drive it forward. Because it's really way too easy in those environments to just fall back to be like, it's just easier if we all come into the office. It's way too easy to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very easy. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything before I move on to the next question. There's lots of really good points there.
I would just add that if you take a look at what's happening at a macro level, the shifts that we're seeing, they aren't going to be unwound anytime soon. And the amount of newness that is being injected into the way every business thinks about operating, the way we recruit and retain talent, we've never had so much access to so much newness, at least not in my career. And so it behooves a company to have someone in charge of just absorbing all of this newness. Like, we now have product market fit for tools that would not have existed 5 years ago. Now that so much of the world is moving into this new way of work, new tools can exist. Well, who's going to evaluate those tools? How do we do an A/B comparison of what we used to do versus what we need to do? There's so much newness and change that it needs to have an owner. It needs to have someone looking after it to make sure that the right things are injected into the organization at the right time.
That was literally the catalyst at Doist for us to look into hiring for this role. Was basically we're like, we want to do remote work at a really high level. We feel like we have been, but the game has changed. It's like drinking from a fire hose, trying to keep up with all these tools that are coming out to solve remote work issues now, when 5 years ago we were literally struggling to find an alternative to tools that we didn't really love using, but we were like, oh, we only have one option, this is what we'll go with. And now it's the total opposite. So it's almost like we just need someone to disseminate all this information and figure out how do we not fall behind, because that game has changed completely.
The one other thing I'll add here is, if you look at heads of remote over the past 2 years, many of them were hired in a state of crisis or emergency, as in, let's build a foundation to get us through for now. But the opportunity ahead is, wow, what can our company look like without the preconceived notions of walls, without the burden of the office? What can community and belonging and connection look like now that we don't have those vestiges of the past? Someone has to answer that. This is a massive opportunity to build better. And a lot of companies are looking at this, and they're taking advantage of having that permission slip.
I think it's really exciting to think about the future in general. Like, we're all here talking about remote work, and we're all obviously very passionate about that if we're at this event. What do you guys think is the future of this position? It's obviously relatively new. We're still, a lot of us are trying to figure it out as we go, I think. So I would love to pick your brains a little bit. What do you think, how do you think this will evolve as remote work evolves in the next, let's say 5 years or so? Stephanie, you want to kick us off?
I'll start with a slightly controversial opinion. I think if we're successful at our jobs, we'll work ourselves out of a job, because that's how I see my role. Ultimately, in 3 to 5 years, I would hope that everyone in the organization is so comfortable with remote work that I'm no longer needed in this capacity, and it's going to evolve. And related to the previous point, we will always have a workplace to manage, whether it's virtual or in person. We will always have employee experience to manage, whether it's virtual, in person, or both. Right? And that's where I see this role evolving into a much more specific, like, workplace design or employee experience role. And again, it depends on how the company evolves and what its needs are.
I think it's also, I agree 100% with Stephanie, we were talking about this earlier. I also think it evolves to a more consultative role. So I think today, many of the roles, or at least mine, is a part of my role is strategy, but a fairly sizable part of my role is tactics. And so to Darren's point, it's having a conversation around, all right, we're going to be an asynchronous work place. Great, where's the hub for all the information? And how do people find it? And do they know how to do it? And do they have the right access, right? You're asking questions a little bit in a consultative way, but I think over time, to Stephanie's point, as people get more comfortable with it, and you help ingrain the behaviors, particularly to support globally distributed teams, so that the equity remains the same, you then become you become a consultant, right? You have a business that's like, hey, my business was really great during the fully remote. We're kind of not moving as fast as we want. How can the team better leverage the tools in a way? So instead of being the person that says, this is what you need it to be, you become let me help you figure out what makes the most sense for you in the context of being a distributed or remote or hybrid or dynamic, whatever word we're using, workforce.
Yeah, I'll share 2 points here. One is that I predict that in a few years' time, remote work will just be called work.
Work.
We use remote as a signifier now to differentiate between conventional in-office with a commute, more conventional work, and not that. But very soon, we could just drop that. Work will become just work, and where any individual works on any given day will become less important. I think the here and now is this role instructs and informs a subset of workers that has never done this before. It gives them guidance on how to do it. So you're building for the here and now. But the next iteration of this role shifts more into workplace experience and workplace design, as in, well, how do we build something now that we have massive amounts of greenfield opportunity? That's what the next iteration will be.
That sounds like a pretty exciting time. I look forward to that. One of the things that I think a lot of people ask, I wonder if you guys get this question as well, but let's just use a figurative new CEO, new owner who's looking at hiring somebody into this role, and they will ask me, what would I hire them to do? Like, I like the concept, but on day one, like, what are they doing? And so you can take this question and run with it however you want, if you want to use an actual example or just sort of a figurative example. But I would love to know, what do you see a head of remote lead walking in and doing on day one? I'm just going to toss it out to the group. Sam, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I will give my own experience coming into Okta. So I want to say on day one, I built a plan. So I built a plan that was said, who are all the key stakeholders that I need to meet with? What is our decisioning and governing body? What are employees' feedback? What do they care about? What's important to them? Where are the pain points in the organization? And a lot of that was because, again, we were making the shift. People were working remotely during a pandemic, and we had done a lot of foundational things already to support them from a tactic perspective. So a lot of my job in the first day, week, month was around what I like to call a listening, like a listening roadshow. And so I went around and I asked a bunch of questions, and I said, what's working, what's not working, where you have concerns. I got a lot of feedback around being a better cross-functional collaborator. And needing to hear other people's perspectives as we kind of push forward on this journey. And so that's what we did. And within, I guess probably in the first 3 months, we built a roadmap. Not a lot of founders or startup people like to hear the word roadmap because it generally means more than 2 weeks, right? It's got a couple of years attached to it. But we really did kind of an assessment of where was the organization today, where did we want to take the organization, and what did tools and education and things that we needed to do to get the organization there. And so I think like that was my first 3 months there. And it's been really great. And it really created, like I said earlier, advocacy, because I already knew when I started there were 2,500 people. We had an acquisition within 3 months that was another 1,000 people. There was just no way that myself or even the 2 other people on my team could actually push the whole thing forward.
Darren or Stephanie, do you want to add anything to that?
I would say it kind of depends on where you're starting from. But if you don't have a rigorous documentation strategy or a company handbook, that's where you have to start. I have never seen a great remote culture that wasn't also a great writing culture. And especially for transitioning orgs, this can be really daunting. The thought of writing down everything and converting implied to explicit, documenting your values, documenting your ways of working. This is a mind bender for a lot of companies that are just used to tapping people on the shoulder and cascading information through the spoken word. When you're operating in 65 countries, many thousands of people, that doesn't work anymore. That doesn't scale. And so step one is get a documentation strategy down. At GitLab, we refer to this as working handbook first. We're very rigorous about having a single source of truth for everything from values to how things get done in the organization. So if you're looking for skills in your head of remote, a great communicator, a great writer, a great storyteller, I think these will be the dark horse skills of the next decade.
I'm kind of chuckling to myself because I think you guys are the exception to the rule in terms of I think a lot of us are still trying to figure out documentation, and we see the GitLab handbook and we go, we have to do that. Oh man, this is going to take a while. And it's epic what you guys have built there, and it does really set the standard very high because I think, as you said, documentation is uber important for distributed teams, and a lot of us, even if we're operating at what we think is a really high level, that's an area where I know we were talking a little bit backstage that we all feel like we have room for improvement still. And I think across the industry, if we want to call remote an industry, that is definitely true. I would venture to say.
Yeah, and GitLab's handbook is legendary, 2,000 pages, but it didn't start that way. I've seen organizations open up a blank page and just commit to it, and they said, we're going to start here. And it's amazing how far you can go in just 6 or 12 months if you start, and you galvanize people around it, and you start shifting the model.
This has been super interesting already. I mean, I've got a million more questions. I know the audience does, and I know we're running a little bit low on time. So maybe we could bring up some of the audience questions, if that's unless anybody wants to add anything else. But while we're feeling that out, I think it'll take a minute to get the questions up here.
If I could just point out that family resemblance in what we all do. One thing that Sam and I discovered was that red thread of communication, because we have communication background as well. So I think that's really, really important, because you have to not just figure out the strategy, but get people to rally and buy into it. For me, when I started as remote lead, it was twofold, right? The work that I did. One of it was immersing myself in the company culture and then figuring out what that looks like in a remote setting. And the other one was employee experience and life cycle and all the gap analysis and all that stuff, which I think is really important, and then triaging that. So,
how did you triage it? I'm actually curious. I know a little bit about the context of your work, but how did you go about triaging?
I mean, a question we always ask at Cargo.one is, which fire can we let burn?
As is the world of startups, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Which one is extra critical given the situation we're in? So I started with an audit with team leads of like how they're running their meetings, their touch points and stuff like that, because it was reaching a breaking point, right? We were moving into remote work, but heavily synchronous. So like coaching them in how to evolve their OS. But also, because we were hiring so much last year when I joined, I needed to look at employee onboarding, and that was urgent because we had so many people coming in. So that's how we triage, just kind of like what's critical, what's urgent. Eisenhower matrix is your best friend, and then just going from there.
Great advice. I can't see the questions, so I'm going to step over here. Polls show the biggest challenge for management is effective communications. How do you meet this need for manager given the responsibility for direct reports? How do you meet this need for manager given the responsibility for direct reports?
I can start with this one. Yeah, I think the point here is well understood, which is effective communication is kind of where this begins and ends. And this is an interesting thread, that communication is really at the heartbeat of what a great head of remote is. You have to teach people how to communicate in new ways. At GitLab, we have this concept of low context communication, which paradoxically means you're expected to communicate with a high degree of precision and detail, assuming that someone knows nothing about whatever you're conveying, and you need to provide as much context as possible so that they can read it and absorb it and self-serve whenever they may come into contact with that information. You can't expect that managers will know how to do this. Paul McKinley at Cimpress was up here earlier today, and he specifically said that as he was building out his remote-first team, not just one person, an entire team, he had someone devoted to learning and development and someone devoted to onboarding to ask these questions. What do our managers need to know about effective communication? What do we need to teach them? How do we need to upskill them? It becomes a critical part of L&D.
L&D is another one I hope we have time to get to. I know we're running a little bit short, but I think that's a really good point. And I often tell people that being succinct yet thorough is extremely important. There's people that are very vocal, they have lots of ideas, and they can tell you about them all day long, but succinct and thorough and communicating in a very unique remote first way or dynamic way is super important. And I think you do have to retool some people and help them understand how to do that in a distributed environment. Anybody else want to add on to that one before we jump to the next one? Let's see. Worst mistake you've made as a head of remote and that we should all avoid. Oh, that's fun.
That's a fun
Thank you for upvoting that one.
I think for me, it was assuming that everybody was on the same page.
Ooh, how so?
Because I think you have different dynamics particularly in larger organizations and organizations that are making the transition from traditional organizations to either hybrid or fully remote first. And so I think the two things on that is assuming everybody's on the same page is probably the worst mistake I made, but then assuming positive intent is the best thing I ever did. Like, people don't know what they don't know. They only know what they have been conditioned to or what they've experienced. And so look at yourself as a teacher, as a way to kind of gain advocacy, and don't assume that just because they have a differing opinion or they may not agree with you, that they're not coming from a place of good intent as well.
Worst mistake I made was overestimating the readiness of some of the changes I wanted to bring, and then, like just running ahead when people were not ready, and then just having people freak out.
Yes, also that.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll ditto that one. I had the same problem. I thought like, oh great, I'm going to jump into this position. I'm going to make all these great changes that I know everybody wants, and change is hard, and it's hard to get everybody rowing in the same direction. So, taking that step back before taking 2 steps forward, I think is important. Darren, have you ever made a mistake?
Of course. The only thing
You don't have to tell us. We'll keep this.
I'll say the thing I'll add there is that always go into every conversation asking, what do I not know?
Yeah.
You'll learn a lot if you do that, and it makes you more vulnerable by default.
I agree with that completely. This is good. What are the best practices to implement your local culture when you hire globally? Creating culture in a distributed environment. Everybody tells you can't do it. It's impossible. You're just a bunch of robots working distributed, right? So culture is not a real thing. But how do you guys go about this? And what is, maybe even going a bit deeper, since we're talking about, do you need a head of remote? How do you influence that culture in your organizations?
At GitLab, we're very specific that we don't hire for culture fit. We hire for values fit. And I think that mentality is critical to allowing local cultures around the world to be properly infused. Because when you invite people to join your company and you're fully aligned on values, you enable them to bring all of their culture to the workplace. And so it starts by actually taking the attention away from the word culture and focusing on values, and that opens the door for people to bring them their full selves and their culture to work. Why should we aim to hit a culture bar? We should aim to above that, and being values aligned is critical for that.
I really like that, because I think there's 2 points there. One, I think that's how you prevent having a totally homogenous group of people that all think the same way. It's great to have people in there who bring a different culture in, and I think it would be a shame not to embrace that part of distributed work, where it's really a superpower. If you have people that are distributed around the globe, bringing in different experiences, challenging problems in different ways. I think this is one of the things that makes remote teams really powerful. And if you're always aligning for the perfect culture fit, then you could potentially miss out on that.
I still think, though, on the other side of that there is company culture, right? And I think, to Darren's point, it's based in the values. But I think there is a sense of belonging and sense of inclusivity when you also have company culture. So we think about culture both at the company level, that's really driven by values, and then locally by teams. So sometimes it's by geography, sometimes it's by the team, sometimes it's by the experience programs that we develop for them. So I still think that culture has a role, and culture isn't something, I do think you have to work at it. right? Because otherwise, I do think culture has a tendency, particularly in larger organizations, to be a little nefarious is probably a little bit too tough of a word, but sometimes it can get that way, right? If you're not focused on helping the teams build the right culture around inclusivity, belonging, freedom of ideas, vulnerability, all of those things that are all values-based, but how you weave that into every part of how your organization engages with an employee is how I think you drive some of that culture.
I'm curious, how do you guys influence culture in your organization? Is it something you feel like you have are you at the steering wheel? Can you steer that ship pretty strongly, or are you kind of assisting from the sidelines? I think this could be different in each company. I'm curious.
So for us at Okta, we really talk about it from a fully cross-functional way. So I wouldn't say I'm steering the boat, but I'm definitely influencing, like, which direction we go, like what's going to be included in our learning and development that really isn't couched in the word culture, but drives the culture that we are looking to achieve across the organization, whether that's with our people leaders, with our, our individual contributors, our team leads, our sales teams, whatever that looks like.
I'll get to the next question if either of you want to add anything to that before. We've got a few minutes left. For large-scale teams, how often do you recommend in-person team, department, and global in-person meetings? Do you recommend a particular cadence or best practice? Stephanie, I would love to hear your opinion on this.
I don't know that we're a large-scale team yet. We're almost 120. But we have 2 company offsites a year, and then we're aiming to have more frequent team offsites, and also supporting local meetups for people to just fly and meet, because sometimes I get this feedback like, hey, you're in this remote thing, why do people have to meet? And I think there's magic in being in person, and no one in the remote work industry, like you said, would deny that, I think. It's just about creating those opportunities for shared experiences. I was chatting with someone earlier about shared experiences and how that's really what drives culture and is the glue for the company. So fairly frequent, I would say, for our team.
Correct, like twice a year, 2-3 times a year at least, people at Cargo.one would expect to see each other, right?
Yeah.
I think this is a good cadence as well. What do you guys think?
So at GitLab, we get the whole team together once a year, which is becoming increasingly difficult as the team scales. But there's also value in providing budgets for sub-teams, whether that's sales or product or engineering, to get together on a somewhat more regular basis. Again, it depends. Ask your people. Also consider budgets for onboarding people in cohorts and getting people together to really infuse that, get that foundation built early on. This is a great question, and I'm glad it was asked, because an in-person strategy is critical to a remote work strategy. And I know it seems a bit strange that we're at the Running Remote conference and we're all delighted to be seeing each other in person instead of in a virtual window, but it goes to show that strategic in-person moments matter a lot, and they take on much more weight. There's a lot of gravity that's attached to that. So if you're a leader, carve out the budget to do it. It enables a lot of great asynchronous collaboration to happen after those in-person touch points.
Yeah, I have been challenged on this as well, because it's one of the core functions of my job is to manage as the head of remote, I'm managing all our co-located events, and that's always seems backwards, and people have a lot of questions around that. But as you just said, Darren, I think this is how you do remote work at a sustainable level. This is how you do it for the long term, and I think we've shifted from how do we do this? We're in a pandemic. We need to make remote work happen now to, okay, how do we optimize this for the long term? And that's one of those key elements of optimizing for the long term is getting your IRL strategy right. And so I think that's why it sits in our domain often.
I mean, the point is not to never see each other. It's for business to happen even if we don't see each other, right? So that's
well put. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think we've got time for one more questions, so let's see what's up at the top here. What is the biggest misconception you face around the role of head of remote? My answer is probably what I just said, that it has nothing to do with co-located events, when in reality it's like 50% that. So I'll turn it over to you all.
I'd say the biggest misconception that I see is that you can get away without it. And it's true. You can probably manage through it. But if you really want to be progressive and build something better, things tend to work better when you put someone who's passionate about it in charge of it. And so it really it depends on who do you want to be as an organization? Who do you want to be known as? And for great talent around the world seeking their next opportunity, when they look at organizations and see that there is someone there advocating for not just allowing or enabling remote work, but truly supporting it and building something better, that's going to send a signal that they'll find their people there and they'll have an advocate when they come on board.
Yeah, we use the word intentionality a lot in remote work, right? So we say that all the time, and I think this is one of those elements where, like, if you leave remote work to happenstance, you can probably get by for a little while. If you have somebody intentionally leading and driving that charge forward, you're probably going to do it at a really high level, and so you just need to make the decision between mediocrity and shooting for the stars in a lot of ways.
I think another misconception sometimes is about it's about presence. So head of remote means, oh, I come to the office or I don't come to the office. That's not at all what it means at all. And I get that a lot. They're like, oh, so you just decide, you tell everybody they don't have to come to the office. I'm like, yeah, no, that's not actually what I do. But I think that that's a pretty big misconception. And I think it probably carries over from remote work prior to the pandemic, when people really, if you were working remotely, you were like the less than 3% in the United States workforce, total workforce, that got the opportunity to live a balanced, to some degree, a balanced lifestyle between your work and when you were on and your home life. So I think that's another misconception I get, is that people a lot of times think it's about presence, physical presence. Where are you physically at? And I'm like, it's not really about that at all. That is so low on the totem pole of what we talk about in terms of the other values that we talk about for dynamic work, that it gets lost in translation sometimes.
Mine is exactly the same as yours.
We're totally aligned, as always. I'm going to leave it there. I think that's an awesome point to end on. We've got tons of questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of them, and my timer over here is beeping at me. So we'll end right there. Bring Danny back out, I guess. Thank you all. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you, guys, for the awesome information.
Oh, wow. Wasn't that amazing? For me, as a previously aspiring head of remote and a newly hired head of remote, to hear from the OGs is just fantastic. So I just want to say thank you to Chase, Darren, Steph, and Samantha for learning out loud with us. I want to give a shout out to Doist. They are championing asynchronous work, and they have sponsored this past talk and the coffee cups there in Montreal. Async communication is the power of remote work, and you need to have the right tools in place to make the most out of it. Twist by Doist is the best asynchronous messaging for teams burned out by real-time chat, video calls, and email. Are you tired of constantly being distracted by colleagues' messages? Twist is the perfect tool for deep work in a team setting. You cannot see if people are online. You are encouraged not to notify everyone all of the time. There is no glowing green dot encouraging you to, quote unquote, be always on. It's got the balance just right. 450,000 people have already made the radical switch to Twist to work async, not as soon as possible. Check them out at twist.com/runningremote. Also want to shout out our platinum sponsor, Multiplier. Multiplier's platform simplifies the employment process by taking charge of the complexities involved in expanding and hiring in new markets. Imagine not having the headaches of payroll, compliance, employment contracts, taxes, and benefits, so that you can instead focus on finding the best talent with paramount confidence. Multiplier's motto is making international employment easy and risk-free. They help employers enter into new markets, fast-track growth, and avoid the hassle of incorporating a new entity. People at Multiplier have always pioneered for employers to become confident and employ globally, and to encourage their employees to work from places Work from places that bring out their productivity and happiness, be it from the comfort of their homes, a co-working space, or even the beach if they like. Build and scale your remote teams across the globe. Our incentive is that we're running a 3 months free offer to all attendees of Running Remote. The offer is redeemable against the company, giving businesses unlimited use of our employment software so that they can hire as many new employees as they wish, free of charge for 3 months. We provide a comprehensive platform to manage your global teams compliantly and take care of payroll, taxes, social contributions, and local insurance policies. Check them out at www.usemultiplier.com/LP/running-remote. Also, our gold sponsors, Juno. If you would like to take your well-being programs to the next level, our event sponsor, Juno, is here for you. Juno's vision is a better life for all of us, living freely and thriving with less stress and more joy. Juno wants to create a world where employers actively encourage and create joyful lives rather than hinder them. With Juno, your team can choose how they take care of their well-being by accessing hundreds of globally available and meaningful products and services. This means that they can get exactly what they need to support their well-being inside and outside of work, regardless of their location. Each one of your employees gets a monthly allowance of Juno points, which can be spent in 3 ways: on our marketplace, through a virtual Juno card, and the reimbursements feature. Reach out to sales at withjuno.com and mention that you came through Running Remote to get a 10% off your first month's employee allowance and 1 month fee free. They are doing 15 points giveaway and additionally 200 points referral for anyone who successfully refers their company. Check them out at www.withjuno.com/runningremote. Also, the other gold sponsor is, Staff Virtual. Staff Virtual, choosing the right outsourcing company to partner with is not an easy decision, especially for first-time outsourcers. It's always a matter of trust and personal relationship. I would like to recommend you our event sponsor and company that we have partnered with for a year. To date, Staff Virtual has employed thousands of employees across the Philippines, from the northernmost part to all the way to the south. Staff Virtual aims to help companies around the world in future-proofing their business by developing proven and tested remote management methodologies, taking into consideration enterprise-grade management, equipment, IT support, and cybersecurity, as well as business continuity plans to strategically help companies grow without the pains and headaches of remote management. They are experts at quickly standing up teams of Filipino professionals that make their clients' business more efficient and profitable. Schedule a free consultation by visiting www.staffvirtual.com. It's awesome listening and learning out loud with you all this afternoon. Coming up, we are going to be talking with Nathan Barry, CEO of ConvertKit. Also on stage 2, the future of teamwork is going to be with Sally Thornton, founder at Forshay. Talk to you soon.